So I am very happy that Dr. Madikay Senghore has agreed to give our very first introduction to SIR model lecture. Madikay studies the genomic epidemiology of pathogens to understand the impact of clinical interventions like vaccination and antimicrobial therapy on the population structure of pathogens such as Streptococcus pneumoniae, Staphylococcus aureus, and Mycobacterium tuberculosis. He has developed a keen interest in understanding the determinants that shape transmission dynamics of bacterial infections, including the role of bottleneck sizes and within host evolution, as well as other factors such as spatial and temporal distance between hosts. In future, this work will inform his interests on the evolutionary trade-offs between transmissibility and virulence, which will be important in understanding why we have such a huge burden of endemic disease in Africa. To meet these aims, he's working to improve his skills in data science, biostatistics, and infectious disease modeling. So, Madikay, please go ahead and get our feet dipped into the waters of ID modeling.
Thank you, Jess. Thanks for the kind introduction. Before I start, just a quick check. Can everybody see my screen? And can you hear my voice loud enough?
Sounds great.
Sounds good. Perfect. All right. So welcome again to the Diversity Conference. And today I'm going to talk to you about the SIR model. And this is like a healthy staple in the diet of infectious disease modelers. It's a very fundamental model that's very simple and very straightforward, but very powerful in terms of answering very complex questions about infectious diseases. So to start off with, I thought I'd start off with a brief recap, and I'm glad that our first speaker has really touched on these things and put them in context very well. But understanding the burden of disease is important because infectious diseases, they not only cause loss of life and well-being, but it also has economic implications on individuals, people losing their jobs or missing time off work. It also sometimes can lead to long-term medical problems as well, where people develop serious long-term illnesses. So models, they help us to predict where the disease will end up. So in terms of which populations are more likely to be hit, when are we expecting those populations to be hit? What resources are we going to need in order to support those populations? And sometimes models can also be used retrospectively after the fact to understand the true burden of disease, because perhaps maybe not everyone who got sick actually made it to a facility to be tested and counted. So sometimes a model can be used to measure the true burden of disease. So the process of modeling, the simple rule is to keep it simple. Simple models tend to be very powerful. The more complexity you add, the more susceptible you are to variation and noise. So it's typically a process of taking what we know about a disease, acknowledging what we don't know about the disease, thinking about what is possible, and using that to create different scenarios. And those different scenarios can help us to prepare. So for example, we have a best case scenario, worst case scenario, a middle case scenario, and that can help us to prepare for what's to come. And then hopefully you end up with an outcome like this, where you have a nice model that you can put on the catwalk or in a fancy journal paper. So we've seen some useful applications of models, especially during the time of COVID. And this was a very early paper by our colleagues at CCDD. And this excellent paper in Science was led by Stephen Kistler and Christine Tedijanto. And what they did was they looked at different possible scenarios for what could happen with COVID. So at that time, COVID hadn't been widespread in the US, but we'd seen it spread in other places. So we knew how much it could spread. And we also knew that certain interventions were useful in terms of reducing the burden of COVID. And later in the talk, I hope that I'll be able to have a small question and answer session with you, the students, to see how different interventions would be modeled for in a typical infectious disease model, right? So here they just said, okay, well, if we have intervention for this long and we reduce transmission over a spectrum, then what are the total number of cases that we're going to see? And that sort of helped public health officials to plan ahead in terms of what they might expect to see. This is another example, again, by Maurice Kramer, who's also a friend of the CCDD. And here they're looking at human mobility patterns. The concept being that diseases are spread by humans. So if you can track where humans are going, you'll have an idea of where the disease is likely to end up. Just like, when COVID hit Europe, we knew that most flights from Europe land in New York City. So it wasn't a surprise when New York City had a major outbreak. So I'm going to take a step back now, and I'm going to engage you all a little bit. So this is a simple example here where we have a bucket, all right? And water is flowing from the bucket or from a pitcher into the bucket. And the idea here I want to put across is that the flow between the bucket and the pitcher is independent of how much water you have in the bucket. It's just flowing at a certain pace. So let's say if, for example, 3 liters are flowing every minute, you can keep track of how much water is flowing into the bucket over time, right? And if you keep track of it long enough, you sort of get this relationship where water's flowing out of one bucket and into the other bucket, and the rate is sort of constant, right? Now remember this, because I'll come back to it in a minute. If we look at another, like a second scenario here, for example, right? Now what we do is we introduce a pump. Now, excuse my art. I'm not an artist. I never did well with art in school. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is the concept that the amount of water in the bucket now has a role to play in how much water is being pumped out of here. So if we say that it's going to be a proportion of how much water we have in the pitcher versus increasing with how much water is coming in the bucket. So now we have 2 limiting issues. We have limitation by how much is in the pitcher versus how much is in the bucket. And the reason I give this example is because this is the sort of relationship that you have with infectious diseases, where, with an infectious disease, if you have more people are infected, right, then you have more of a chance of infecting new people. But then after a while, you run out of people who you can infect. So sort of the infectious disease outbreak sort of dies naturally when you have nowhere else to go. And that is, from a modeling perspective, that is probably one of the first principles that you would be exposed to in terms of this difference between a non-communicable disease and a communicable infectious disease. In a non-communicable disease, if the people around you are infected or they're sick, it doesn't put you at risk. If you're caring for a patient, a family member who has a non-communicable disease, it doesn't put you at risk of contracting it. However, if that disease is communicable or it's transmissible, then the more people around you that are infected, the greater your risk of infection, right? So I want to sort of engage you at this point. Can you think of some examples of non-communicable diseases? You can drop something in the chat, or you can just, jump in and give me an example. Diabetes, exactly. Hypertension, cancer, fantastic. Excellent examples. Asthma, fantastic. Yes, asthma indeed. Excellent. And can we get some examples of communicable diseases, perhaps? Flu, fantastic. TB, yeah. One more perhaps? Hepatitis, fantastic. Ebola, fantastic. Yes, these are all examples of very prominent infectious diseases. So if in terms of how we would model a disease, right? So typically what the SIR framework does is that it takes a population and it separates it into people in the population who are susceptible, meaning they can catch the disease, and people who are infected. And in the case of an infectious disease, people who are infectious, meaning that they can infect others. But in the case of a non-communicable disease, like we said, the rate of incidence is sort of a per capita rate that is not really affected by how many people are infected. So eventually in the population, you get to a steady state where you get a steady flow of people getting infected and recovering. And the prevalence of the disease is sort of steady. It may change seasonally because there might be exposure factors that change it, but generally it's steady. So if you want to model this, the first thing you want to model is at what rate are people transitioning from the susceptible to the infected compartment? And then you also want to incorporate the concept of recovery. So in our first bucket, we didn't have any recovery. We just had water flowing into one bucket. However, for most diseases, people do recover. Things like headaches, for example, people do recover after some time. And they recover usually at a given rate. So you'd have maybe, it takes maybe 5 days to shake it off or 3 days on average. So that recovery, that recovery period can be used to calculate what's called a recovery rate. And the recovery rate is simply just 1 over how many days it takes you to recover. And you'll see in the practical session that you do after this, how that actually works when you code it. So it's really straightforward, right? Now, when we talk about an infectious disease, it's a little bit different, right? Because it includes transmission, but transmission itself is not like all we all. I mean, just because you encounter somebody who has the disease doesn't mean you get sick. So how do we think about that from a modeling perspective? Well, the first requirement is that you actually have to make contact with people, right? Or you have to make contact with the source of the infection. We're going to keep it simple here and assume that the infection is coming from other people, not from secondary or tertiary sources, right? So first of all, you have to make contact with people. That's number one. And two, one of those contacts or more have to be infected. And three, there is now the question of, well, if you do meet somebody or if you do encounter somebody who has COVID or any other infectious disease, for example, do you actually get the infection? Three, do you actually pass it on? So, I mean, this is just an illustration of how some germs might get transmitted from one person to another. But in terms of the rate at which infections are occurring in the population, there are a number of things that you consider. One is on average, the number of contacts the person makes. So how many contacts are you making during the day? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 20? Depends. Then there is the chance of you should think about the prevalence first, which is out of those people I'm contacting. So if there's a 20% prevalence in the population and I encounter 5 people in the day, then there's a likelihood that one of those 5 is going to be infected. Then the question is, what is the chance that that person actually gives me whatever infection that they have? And again, this all matters because this all depends on how many people you have in the population that are susceptible to start off with. So when you put it all together, first of all, you create this term, which is the transmission coefficient, which is beta. And beta is the product of B, the chance of infection given contact, and K, the number of contacts that you're making. So how many people go from being susceptible to infected at a given point in time depends on how many people you have susceptible, how many people are infected in the population, and this transmission coefficient, which is a product of human behavior and pathogen behavior as well. Human behavior being how many contacts you're making, and pathogen behavior being when you do give the pathogen an opportunity to infect someone, how well is the pathogen going to do in terms of infecting that person, right? So let's look at this in a sort of a cartoon model kind of thing. So you start off with a susceptible population, right? You introduce a case or a person who is able to infect others. And let's say for this virus in this population, on average, a person that's infected will infect 2 other people on average, right? Give or take. It's not a 100% certified rule of thumb. Some people might infect more, some people might infect less because human behavior patterns are different, right? So now I think at this point, we have to pause and think about the natural history of infection, right? So when an individual gets infected, typically what happens is, let's pretend it's a virus, although bacteria can infect as well, but viruses are sort of easier to model. But you get this rapid sort of replication of the virus inside the body, right? And during this period, the person becomes very infectious, meaning that if you contact them, they have a high viral load, you're likely going to get infected, right? But at the same time, the human body is also reacting to this infection. So the human body starts recognizing this virus and it starts creating these antibodies, which are proteins, which basically sort of like tag the virus like, oh, this is the bad guy, get him out of the system kind of thing. And over time, these antibodies continue to develop and become stronger and stronger to the point that they overwhelm the virus and the infection subsides. And that is why we have to introduce the R term in the SIR model. R meaning that this individual has recovered. And in most cases, when an individual is recovered, they cannot get infected again, or maybe over time, after a long time, the antibodies sort of die down and they can get infected again. But that's the complexity that we're not going to touch on here. For now, we're just going to assume that once you hit R, you're good. You're not going to get infected again. So, you know, if we sort of play this movie out, we see that after the next generation cycle, this individual here has now recovered, but the 2 they infected have now infected 2 new ones. So you have 6 here now, right? You move on 1 more cycle and these 2 recovered. Now you have 3 recovered. And then you have now, 6 here and 5 here, right? You notice I put 5 here deliberately to emphasize that it's not necessarily that everybody's going to infect 2, but roughly it rounds out to about 2. But the point I want you to see here is that from the start, there is a quick, very, very the situation gets bad very quickly, right? And this is why infectious disease modeling is different from non-infectious disease modeling. This is referred to as exponential growth. It means that you're doubling every time you're doubling, every time you're doubling, every time you're doubling. So before you know it, you go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, or even from 2 to 4 to 16 to, and it just explodes very quickly. Now imagine if this is like a massive population, how quickly you can go from 10, 20 cases to thousands of cases. And that's why it's really important to understand this dynamic. But again, here you'd find some individuals like this individual here, came into contact with infected, but somehow didn't get infected. And eventually all the people around them recovered. So they have no one to infect them, basically. So how do we model this in terms of the modeling? So there's 2 things we need to consider. How many people are getting from being susceptible to now being infected? And how many of those people are now becoming recovered? And we saw earlier how people get infected, right? You have the transmission coefficient. At a given point in time, you're keeping track of how many people are infected, and you know how much of a risk they pose to someone in this category, and that gives you an idea. The next step is, well, what's happening in this compartment? Because we know individuals are getting infected and individuals are also recovering. So you have the S's that are coming into the eyes, which is here. And then you have the eyes that are recovering, which is accounted for by this term. And again, gamma is 1 over the total of the recovery period in days, right? So you can see, typically when you design an SIR model and you run it, you will see this sort of pattern where you start off with a mostly susceptible population, 1 or 2 infected individuals, and it quickly goes from a situation where you have a few infections to a situation where you have a lot of infections. And eventually you sort of reach the peak of the outbreak where the number of individuals who've recovered is growing, the number of susceptibles is getting down. So at this point, an infected person is more likely to encounter either another infected individual or an individual that has already recovered. So you're not getting as many new infections as you were getting at this stage, where here, an individual who's infected here is more likely to encounter a susceptible individual and create a new infection, right? So I guess this is the fun part of the talk, or at least I hope so. So what I want us to do is to apply what we've discussed or what we've learned so far to answer a few scenarios. So we're going to look at what happens when, if there's an airborne disease outbreak, what happens when you mask, when individuals start using face masks, and how can you account for this in your model? Again, when you have lockdowns and social distancing, how can you account for this? When you're treating patients so that you reduce the infectious period, how does this translate in the model? And also, if individuals get infected and they're self-isolating, how do you account for it? And finally, I'll touch on vaccine status as well. So we have 4 questions here. And whenever I get to a slide, I'm going to launch a poll and I want to get feedback from you to see what you think. So the first one is masking in an airborne outbreak. So let's do just a quick recap here of what we've learned, right? So we know that in order for transmission to happen, you need to make contact with people, and that one of those contacts has to be infected. And then there has to be a transmission actually happening. So you have human behavior aspect here, how many contacts are people making? You have population dynamics aspects here, what proportion of the population are infected? And you also have pathogen dynamics here in terms of when you do create an opportunity for transmission, how well does the bacteria or the virus take advantage of that situation, right? So the first question here is, and let me see if I can launch this poll. There we go. Okay. So the first question is, what parameter in the transmission coefficient changes with widespread use of face masks? So when people start wearing face masks, right, are you changing the number of contacts made, or are you changing the chance of infection given contact, A or B? So I'm going to launch the poll now, and I'll give you a minute or so to think about the answers. Oh, wow. 5, 6, 7. Okay. Can you see this box that has the results from the poll? Okay, so we have 10 out of 10 answers. Perfect. So let me share the results with you now. Can everybody see the results? So everybody agreed that you're actually changing the risk of infection given contact. And you're right, you are changing the risk of infection given contact, because people are still going to get on the train, they're still going to get on the bus as usual. But the only difference is now you're actually protecting yourself from infection. So even if you encounter somebody who has who is infectious, your chance of catching the infection are reduced. Brilliant. So now we can actually model this, right? We can model this by saying, okay, well, if we change, if the mask is 20% protective, and we're giving a modest estimate here because we're accounting for the fact that, well, not everybody will wear a mask, and some of those who wear it will not wear it properly. So let's say it's 20% protective at a population level. What we see is that this is, a model with no mask, and you see the infections rising and falling, and you see that the maximum here is like somewhere around 150. Whereas now with the masking, what you're seeing is that you're getting maybe closer to like 75 cases at the peak of the outbreak. And also, importantly, the R value here is much lower. So this means that you had around 600 infections in total, right? Whereas here you had closer to 800 infections, right? So not only is, let's say, the burden on your healthcare facilities lower at the peak of the outbreak, but you also reduce the total number of cases that you get, right? So similar again, oh, I think I might have given you the answer, right? But similar, now let's think about lockdowns and social distancing, right? So when you do lockdowns, when you ask people to stay at home, are you changing? Let me see if I can launch this poll. Question number 2. What component of the model are you changing? Similar to the first question, are you changing A, the number of contacts, or B, the risk of infection given contact? Oh, wow. Oh, wow. This is quite amazing. Again, we have 100% agreement on the answer. I think, Jess, I think we might need to think about some infectious disease fellowships for this group. We have a really good group on our hands.
No, they're great.
Yeah, they are fantastic. So again, yes, spot on. When you introduce something like, so sorry, I couldn't show this slide because I messed up the animations and I'd given you the answer pretty much. But basically, when you ask people to stay at home, for example, or you ask people to work virtually some days of the week, and you have some sort of a hybrid system, all of these strategies are meant to reduce the number of contacts, right? And if you look at this example here right at the bottom, again, the peak is much lower. And we've heard a lot about flattening the curve. And this is a classical example of flattening the curve. You have much fewer cases at the peak, and also it's sort of spread out a bit more, and you end up with fewer cases overall in total, right? Brilliant. So now the next question, which is going to be about treating patients. So typically, if you have like a mild infection and you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you medicine, the idea is that, well, you get better faster, right? So now you're actually changing the recovery period, right? So the question is, let me launch the poll. If at a population level, you introduce treatment for patients who are infected that reduces the recovery time, what parameter in your model are you changing? And how are you changing it? So I've just launched the poll. I'll give you 2 minutes to think about this one because it might be a little bit more tricky. So yeah, think about it and let me know what you think. Wait, sorry, let me. Okay, so I think we have half of the answers in. Okay, we have some difference of opinion on this question, slight difference of opinion. Okay, all right, I'm going to end the poll now in the interest of time. and I'm going to share the results. So I want in the chat, or you can jump in and give your reasoning. Someone who thinks that gamma gets larger, why do you think gamma gets larger?
So, in my mind, after saying the formula, when we increase the recovery rate, we also shorten the period of time it takes for recovery. And if we shorten the denominator, we're going to get a larger value.
Precisely. So those who said gamma gets smaller, do you still think gamma gets smaller? And why would you think that? Okay, so that's the thing. That's the gist of it. Basically, if you treat people, you put people in a situation where they spend less time in I, so the rate at which people transition out of I into R becomes faster. And when you put this in your model, this is sort of what you get. You get standard model, again, you get the nice shape curve, 20% faster recovery, the peaks get, the peak slows down, and 50% faster recovery. Well, you almost don't really have an outbreak. You completely shatter the curve, and you don't just flatten it, you completely shatter it, right? So we've seen at least 3 different ways where you can target an outbreak, right? You can target the human behavior aspect, the viral aspect, or the population dynamics aspect as well. So now, last question. And here, I'm sort of introducing something new to you. And this is the idea that you can actually deviate from the structure of your SIR model by incorporating a new compartment, right? So you have your standard SIR model, but now you say, well, what's going to happen is when someone tests positive, we're going to ask them to self-isolate, stay at home or stay, in their own bedroom or something, so that they don't infect any new people, right? And this is going to happen at a rate of alpha, for example, taking into consideration that not everyone who tests positive is going to go into self-isolation, right? And then they're going to recover as well into the R compartment. So the question is, when an individual goes into self-isolation, how does this impact the model? Or when you ask individuals who are infected to go into self-isolation, how does this change the model? You say A, not at all. B, you decrease the number of I that can infect new S, or C, it changes the recovery time so that less people are infected. So I'll launch this final poll. There we go. All right. Brilliant. Okay, so let me share these results. And the answer is B. That the idea behind this is that you reduce the number of people that are actually eligible to infect others, right? And that when you model this now, you would have this in your compartment so that when people are in I, they transition into Q and they can no longer infect new people. So quickly, I think I'll try and wrap up so we have time for questions at the end. I want to introduce the idea of vaccination as well. So if you have a vaccine, typically what a vaccine does in an ideal scenario is that it takes people who are susceptible, not infected, it creates antibodies, it triggers the immune system to create antibodies, and they become recovered, meaning they can no longer be infected. I'm not sure if I included this in the polls, but you can just put your answers in the in the chat, A, B, or C. So when you vaccinate a population, how does this change in the model? A, not at all. B, it decreases the prevalence, P, i.e. it decreases the number of infected at the time T, or C, it reduces the number of susceptibles in the population. Brilliant. Right. So I think we have consensus again. Mostly it's that the agreement is that it is C, you're reducing the number of susceptibles. I mean, as a knock-on effect, you sort of reduce the number of eyes as well, right? Because eventually over time, fewer people are available to become infected. So the peak sort of flattens as well, the curve flattens as well, and you avoid that exponential growth. Now, in the real world as well, vaccines don't always work as you hope that they would work. So there are some scenarios, for example, in an all or nothing vaccine, where when you vaccinate an individual, it's either they have full protection or they're not protected at all. So you'd have vaccine failure or you'd have the vaccine working. And in which case, the rate at which people go from S to R would be pi, the rate of vaccination, and mu here is the rate of vaccine failure. So only the people who do not get vaccine failure end up in R, and the rest sort of stay in R, and the SIR model progresses as normal. And my colleague Mary, who will be doing one of the practical sessions, has done a fantastic model, which was published very recently, looking at how vaccination changes. It's a much more complex model, one that I personally can't explain, but it's an example of how, you know, this simple framework can be used to answer really powerful questions. Another example is a leaky vaccine. So this is where the vaccine protects the people, but not 100%. So maybe if you're vaccinated, you have an 80% chance of protection against the virus, but there's still a chance that you could be infected. So there, what happens is vaccinated individuals come into the V compartment where they're protected, and the beta term here, B of V, is much lower than the beta term for the rest of the population. And again, this has an impact of flattening the curve because much fewer people actually get infected over time, and you sort of slow the pace of the epidemic significantly. And also, importantly, the people in this compartment are more likely to not get sick. Even if they get infected, they're more likely to not get sick. So a quick recap, you know, I hope that I did a good job of introducing you to the basic SIR model framework, of introducing the basic parameters of the SIR model, so the transmission coefficient, and also the recovery parameter as well. And I also hope that, you know, it's been clear to you how you can incorporate interventions in a simple SIR model and how that can translate to what you're seeing when you actually run the model. I hope that, you know, you had fun in this session. I hope that the interactive parts were fun for you. I'm really excited about how well you did with all the questions. And I think it sets the tone for a really nice conference going ahead. And finally, you know, I hope that this sort of breaks the ice and the thought of modeling is not as scary as you might have thought. And I also hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. So congratulations on, you know, finishing this first session. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. And I think we have time for a few questions. Jess, do we have time for a few questions?
Yep, absolutely.
Brilliant. And also just to point out, my colleague just did highlight to me that this parameter is actually lambda and not gamma. So I think that exposes the fact that I am a biologist trying to masquerade as a modeler. But yeah, is there a question in the chat? Yeah, I think Joy says, could this presentation be made available to us? Yes, certainly. We're gonna
Yeah, we have, so the participant Dropbox folder that Jess circulated earlier, we're going to be including all the materials for the breakout sessions and the lecture slides for the speakers who choose to share their slides.
I do have a question. I know that at some point there was a talk about like herd immunity, and that hasn't been talked about as much now. I guess it's kind of, I don't know if it's out of reach, or now we're talking about the epidemic being like an endemic, and that's gonna be something we're just gonna stick with for a while. So how does that affect, like, how have the models changed from before, where it was about increasing vaccination rates so that, you know, like less people are infected or less people get as sick, with so many people not getting vaccinated? Has that affected the like efficacy rate, like the efficacy of the vaccine? Has that changed like the situation?
Good question. Good question. So I'm gonna bring in my colleague Mary to touch on this, but just to sort of so the herd immunity threshold that is spoken about is sort of, if you remember in the cartoon slides that I shared earlier, like where you had the green dots and the red dots and the gray dots. So when you get to herd immunity, it just means that you have enough people that are sort of recovered, but cannot get infected anymore, to the point that if a person is infected, they're more likely to encounter someone that's already recovered than a new person. So you don't get that massive spike in cases anymore. And the transmission just sort of happens in the background. But there's also a concept of waning immunity, which I think perhaps, Mary, do you want to touch on the concept of waning immunity and how it's a bit challenging to model that?
Yeah, hi. This is a really good question. So endemic dynamics, yeah, are different than epidemic dynamics because it's no longer following this trajectory where it's just sort of like burning through the whole population. It's sort of what we call a dynamic equilibrium, where the number of people infected at a given time is not changing very much. And the drivers of that are more complicated than the epidemic dynamics. And it's usually a combination of, I guess, three things. One is just that immunity can wane, so people can move from the susceptible through infection to recovered, and then at some time they can lose their immunity and move back to susceptible. And so people just sort of cycle through. Another thing is that because there's population turnover, new people are being born and they are born without immunity, you're sort of pouring more susceptible hosts into the population. So you sort of infect those, but you don't ever have enough at one time to get a huge epidemic like you did before. And then the third thing is that pathogens can evolve. So you can have people who develop immunity, but then pathogens evolve to overcome that immunity. And you sort of, that's what happens with flu. That's why people have immunity to flu, but we keep getting flu outbreaks every year anyway. So yeah, it's really exciting that you're starting to wonder about endemic dynamics. They, I think, are going to talk about some of these questions and things like herd immunity in some of the subsequent sessions. At least I would guess. So
yes, hopefully Michaela will talk about it. Brilliant. So there's another question of how do you define or measure a susceptible population? And that is by Rukeya. Another excellent question. So in an ideal world, it's sort of like a one-for-one match, where immunity is pathogen based and you have immunity to a pathogen, and then in the population you have, you know, that kind of immunity to a pathogen sort of thing. But sometimes it gets complicated because you have what's called cross protection. So for example, you can have, let's say, in the case of COVID, for example, it's not very clear, but there are some people who wonder if, well, the common cold is also caused by coronavirus. So does that have any sort of effect on whether a population is completely susceptible to COVID or not? And those are some of the dynamics that you think about. There are some pathogens that are really close to each other. And so you might see, for example, that pathogen A has never been introduced in populations X and Y, but it comes in population X and it spreads like wildfire. It comes in population Y and it doesn't spread as much as in population X, right? And the reason being that the cousin of pathogen A, pathogen C, is more endemic in the second population. And even though it's not fully protective, there are some parts of population of these two pathogens that look similar. So the immune system has a vague idea of what this pathogen looks like because it's seen something similar in the past, right? So those are some of the complexities in terms of defining a susceptible population. And you could account for this in your model, for example, by saying that, okay, both populations are susceptible, but in population 1, the chance of infection given contact is higher than in population 2 because their immune systems have seen something similar in the past, and their immune systems will react faster once this new pathogen is involved. So I think I'm sure there are better ways, and I'm sure, Mary, I'm sure there are smarter ways to do this, right? Like accounting for pre-existing immunity.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute and it wasn't working. Yeah, it depends on what the source of the cross protection is. If it was just something like a vaccine, so like an example might be a pandemic flu, like an avian flu that no one has seen. But actually that's a bad example. What's a good example? I don't know. Imagine that there's no circulating virus that has cross protection, but there's a vaccine that does. And you've got some proportion of the population that's received that vaccine. You could just have like 2 compartments, like people who have and have not been vaccinated and different rates of infection for those. If it's a circulating virus that overlaps in terms of immunity, you can have what we call a multi-strain model, which I don't think is going to get covered in this conference because they get a little messy. And then you can sort of track people's infection history on like which of the 2 strains they've been infected with. And then if they've been infected with one, it can lower their risk of becoming infected with the other one. I love those models. They're my jam, but but they get kind of complicated.
All right, thank you guys. So we're gonna take a break now until 3. And after this little 10-minute break, then we're going to split into breakout rooms. And oh yeah, Tiggy just put something very helpful in the chat. Mary's paper, for anyone who's interested, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, Ava also mentioned smallpox vaccination as an example, which is still given in some places and in the military as a vaccine that's not matched by a circulating pathogen. Thanks, Ava.